The day my husband was buried, my family started planning where to put me. They hugged me. They cried with me. They called it care, but it felt like goodbye. They thought I was weak. They didn't realize I was planning my escape. The house had never felt so quiet. For 42 years, it had been filled with the sounds of my husband, his footsteps moving from room to room, the soft hum of the radio he turned on every morning, the way he cleared his throat before speaking. After the funeral, all of it vanished. The silence pressed against my ears so loudly that sometimes I wondered if I was going deaf. I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the chair across from me. His chair. The coffee cup still rested there, untouched since the morning he left for the hospital and never came back. I told myself I would move it later. I told myself many things I didn't believe. Grief doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, like cold through cracked windows. Some days I felt numb, unable to cry. Other days, the smallest things shattered me. A familiar scent on his coat, the indentation his body had left on the mattress, the unfinished crossword on the nightstand. My children started visiting more often after the funeral. At first, I was grateful. I thought it meant they cared. They brought casseroles, sat on the couch, and spoke in gentle voices, as if I might break if they spoke too loudly. But something felt different. Their conversations stopped when I entered the room. Their smiles appeared forced, practiced. They asked questions that made me uneasy. "Do you remember where the paperwork is? Dad handled most of the bills, didn't he? Are you sure you can manage the house on your own?" I answered quietly, nodding more than speaking. I had never been the loud one. My husband had always stood between me and the world, steady and reassuring. Without him, I felt exposed, like a child pretending to be strong. At night, I talked to him in the dark. "I don't know how to do this without you," I whispered, my fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. The bed felt enormous now, empty on his side, cold no matter how many blankets I piled on. The house, once our sanctuary, began to feel unfamiliar. Every room carried memories, but also a warning. Nothing stays the same. I noticed small changes. The mail disappeared before I could open it. Documents were moved to keep things organized. My daughter started answering questions for me when visitors called. They weren't cruel. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, they were kind in a way that felt controlling, like hands gently guiding me where I hadn't agreed to go. One afternoon, I overheard my son speaking on the phone in the hallway. His voice was low, careful. "She's not doing well," he said. "I'm worried about her being alone." I stood there, unseen, my heart sinking. He never asked me how I was doing. That was the moment I realized something had shifted. My grief was no longer just my own. It had become their justification. To them, I wasn't a woman who had lost the love of her life. I was a problem to be managed. As the days passed, their visits became more frequent, but shorter. Decisions were made quickly, efficiently, without me in the room. They spoke about the future as if I wouldn't be part of it. And still, I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, but because I was listening. Because somewhere beneath the grief, beneath the loneliness, a quiet awareness was forming. One that told me this loss was only the beginning. They waited a few weeks before saying it out loud. By then, I was already tired of the silence, tired of waking up alone. Tired of pretending I knew how to navigate a world my husband had quietly protected me from for decades. Grief had softened me, and they sensed it. That was when the conversations changed. "It's just an idea," my daughter said one afternoon, her voice carefully warm as she poured tea into my favorite cup. "We're only thinking about what's best for you." My son nodded, standing by the window with his arms crossed. "You shouldn't be alone right now, Mom." I stared at the steam rising from the cup, watching it fade into nothing. "I'm fine," I said softly. "This is my home." They exchanged a look, brief but loaded. "It wouldn't be permanent," my daughter added quickly. "Just until you get stronger." Stronger. The word echoed in my mind, as if grief were a sickness to be cured by changing locations. They spoke of safety, of routine, of nurses who would check on me, meals I wouldn't have to cook, people around me at all times. They made it sound like a kindness, like a gift they were offering out of love. They never once asked what I wanted. The brochures appeared a few days later, left neatly on the coffee table. Smiling seniors walked through sunny gardens, their silver hair glowing in warm light. Words like comfort, community, and care were printed in soft pastel colors. I flipped through them slowly, my hands trembling. None of the faces looked real. None of them looked lonely. "We'll visit all the time," my son promised. "You won't even notice the difference." But I already did. The decision was made before I ever agreed to it. Appointments were scheduled. Papers were signed. When I hesitated, when my voice cracked and I said I wasn't ready, they gently reminded me of how forgetful I had been lately, of the time I left the stove on, of how quiet I had become. They spoke as if I were fading. On the morning they moved me, I packed a single suitcase. Just one. They told me I wouldn't need much. Clothes, toiletries, a framed photo of my husband and me taken on our anniversary 10 years earlier. I held that photo in my hands for a long time before placing it gently between folded sweaters. I walked through the house one last time. I touched the doorframe where my husband had marked our children's heights as they grew. I ran my fingers across the kitchen counter where we had shared countless meals, laughter, and arguments that always ended in forgiveness. I stood in the bedroom doorway, unable to step inside. No one noticed. They were too busy discussing logistics, what to do with the extra furniture, which bills they would take care of, how soon the house could be cleaned out. As we drove away, I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror. My chest tightened, and I pressed my palm against the window, like a child being taken somewhere unfamiliar. The nursing home was nothing like the brochures. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something older, something tired. The floors were clean but worn. The walls painted a pale color meant to be calming, but somehow made everything feel duller. A television played softly in the corner of the common room, its sound competing with the hum of fluorescent lights. A nurse smiled at me and spoke loudly, slowly, as if I couldn't hear. She took my name, my medications, my history. My children answered most of the questions for me. I felt myself shrinking. My room was small. A bed, a dresser, a narrow window that faced a parking lot instead of the garden I had tended for years. My suitcase sat at the foot of the bed, suddenly looking ridiculous in the empty space. "We'll come back tomorrow," my daughter said, smoothing the blanket like she was tucking in a child. My son kissed my forehead. "Try to rest, Mom." And then they were gone. The door closed with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. That first night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to unfamiliar sounds. Coughing from the next room. A call bell ringing somewhere down the hall. Footsteps passing and never stopping at my door. I clutched my husband's photo to my chest and cried silently, careful not to let anyone hear. Morning came without comfort. Days began to blend together. Breakfast trays arrived at the same time each morning. Eggs lukewarm, toast dry. Activities were announced over the intercom, but I rarely attended. I wasn't ready to smile at strangers who carried their own grief like invisible baggage. My family visited less than they promised. At first, it was every few days, then once a week. Then excuses, work, traffic, the kids were busy. When they did come, they stayed only a few minutes, standing instead of sitting. Checking their phones while asking questions they didn't wait to hear answers to. "Are they treating you well? Everything okay? We've got to run." They always looked relieved when they left. I began to understand the truth slowly, painfully. This wasn't about my safety. It wasn't about care. It was about convenience. I had been placed somewhere quiet, controlled, out of the way, somewhere I wouldn't ask questions. Somewhere my grief could be managed without disturbing their lives. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the parking lot, I sat alone by the window and finally allowed myself to feel something other than sadness. Anger. It surprised me how warm it felt, how alive. Beneath the sorrow, beneath the abandonment, something steady began to awaken. A realization I hadn't been ready to face before. They thought I was done. They thought grief had erased me. But as I stared at my reflection in the glass, older, thinner, but still very much alive, I understood something they had forgotten. I was still here, and I was watching, and I was learning. Time moved differently inside the nursing home. Days no longer had meaning. They were measured by medication cups, meal trays, and the soft chime of the hallway clock that chimed every hour, reminding us how little control we had over our own schedules. Morning bled into afternoon, afternoon into evening, until everything felt like one long, gray stretch of waiting. I learned the routine quickly. Wake up to the sound of carts rolling down the hall. Sit up while a nurse checked my blood pressure without meeting my eyes. Eat breakfast that tasted the same every day. Sit, wait, sleep, repeat. At first, I kept expecting my family to appear unexpectedly, to surprise me, to say it had all been a mistake. I kept my purse packed, my coat folded neatly in the closet, just in case. Weeks passed. No one came. I began noticing the other residents. People I had once avoided looking at too closely, afraid I would see my own future in their faces. There was Mr. Collins, who waited by the entrance every afternoon with his coat on, convinced his daughter was coming. She never did. There was Eleanor, who spoke to her late husband as if he were sitting beside her during bingo. And Rose, who had stopped speaking altogether, her eyes following the door every time it opened. We were a quiet collection of stories no one wanted to hear. One afternoon, during a group activity I hadn't bothered to refuse, a woman beside me whispered, They all say it's temporary. She smiled sadly, like someone sharing a secret everyone already knew. Birthdays came and went unnoticed. When mine arrived, I waited all day for a phone call. I wore my best sweater and brushed my hair carefully. The phone didn't ring. That night, a nurse handed me a small cupcake with a single candle. "Happy birthday," she said kindly. I thanked her, smiling so she wouldn't see how much it hurt. I ate the cupcake alone in my room. The candle melted into wax before I made a wish. Visits from my family became rare events. And when they did happen, they felt staged. They brought flowers that stayed behind when they left. They spoke loudly, cheerfully, as if trying to convince themselves they were good children. "I think this place is really good for you," my daughter said once, standing near the door. "You seem calmer, calmer." As if resignation were peace. I nodded, because arguing took too much energy. Nights were the hardest. Darkness made memories louder. I would lie awake, listening to the quiet sobs of other residents traveling through the thin walls. Sometimes I cried too. Sometimes I didn't. I learned that tears, like visits, eventually stopped coming. It was during one of those long nights that I met Clara. She was a nurse on the late shift, younger than my children, with tired eyes, but a gentle voice. Unlike others, she spoke to me as if I were still a person, not a task. "How are you really doing?" she asked one evening, adjusting my pillow. The question startled me. I almost laughed. "I'm still alive," I said. She smiled, but her eyes softened. That counts for something. Clara began stopping by my room more often. Sometimes she stayed an extra minute to talk. She listened when I spoke about my husband, about the garden I used to tend, about the life I felt slipping further away each day. "They shouldn't have done this to you," she said once, quietly, glancing toward the hallway. I didn't respond, but something inside me shifted. Not everyone treated us kindly. Some staff moved through the halls like ghosts, efficient and distant. To them, we were numbers, charts, room assignments. When we complained, we were labeled difficult. When we stayed quiet, we were forgotten. I learned which nurses rushed and which ones paused. Which doors creaked. Which security camera didn't fully cover the hallway near the exit. I wasn't planning anything yet, but I was paying attention. One afternoon, while sitting in the common room, I overheard a phone conversation at the reception desk. My daughter's voice drifted down the hall, sharp and impatient. "No, just keep her there," she said. "It's easier this way." Easier. The word lodged itself deep in my chest. That night, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not sadness, not anger, but clarity. I understood my place in their lives now. I was no longer a mother or a wife or even a person who mattered. I was an inconvenience that had been neatly stored away. The realization should have broken me. Instead, it steadied me. I began writing again. At first, it was just memories, things I didn't want to forget. The way my husband laughed when he burned dinner. The smell of rain on our porch. Slowly, my writing changed. It became sharper, more deliberate. Lists, dates, names. I noticed that my mail no longer arrived. I asked about it and was told it had been handled. I noticed that forms appeared in my file that I hadn't signed. I noticed that my children spoke confidently about my finances without asking me a single question. They thought I wasn't paying attention. They were wrong. One morning, as I watched the sunrise paint the parking lot gold, Clara stood beside me. "You don't belong here," she said quietly. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since my husband died, I felt seen. "No," I said, "I don't." That was the moment everything changed. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing. Because somewhere beyond those walls, life was still waiting for me. And I was done waiting for permission to live it. Weeks had passed since I had settled into the rhythm of the nursing home. A rhythm I did not like, but one I had learned to endure. I kept busy with the little routines, pretending to sleep during the day so I wouldn't draw attention. I listened. I observed. I watched the comings and goings of the staff, noting the small inconsistencies, the things that didn't make sense. The world outside was still moving, and I was trapped inside a silent cage. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the walls of the nursing home, I overheard a conversation that would change everything. It was in the common area, quiet. As most residents had settled for the night, my daughter's voice drifted across the hallway. I froze, pressing my hands to my knees as I listened. At first, I thought I was imagining it, an echo, a shadow of my own longing. But the words became clearer with each passing second. "Yes," she said. Her tone was clipped, almost impatient. "We sold the house last week. The bank will transfer the money directly. Mom won't even notice. She thinks we're still arranging things for her care." I felt my stomach drop, my pulse quicken. Sold the house, the place that had been ours for decades. The place where my husband and I had built a life together, room by room, memory by memory, gone. And they hadn't even told me. I sank into the chair across from the window, gripping the arms tightly. The room spun around me as I tried to process what I had just heard. My family, the people I had trusted most, had betrayed me. The betrayal was so complete, so cold, that it burned deeper than grief itself. I replayed every interaction over the past weeks. Every forced smile, every hurried visit, every gentle word that had been carefully calculated to keep me quiet. And suddenly, I saw it clearly. They weren't caring for me, they were controlling me. They were eliminating me from their lives entirely, and they had succeeded. The tears came quickly, hot and sharp, but they were not the kind of tears that only mourned loss. These were the tears of anger, of recognition, of awakening. I had been quiet for too long. I had allowed grief to numb me, to blind me to what was happening around me. But now, nothing could stop the clarity. They had underestimated me. That night, in the dim light of my small room, I opened the drawer where I had hidden my few possessions. My husband's photo, the letters we had exchanged over decades, the small trinkets from our travels, everything I held dear. I traced the edges of the photo frame with my fingers, imagining his smile. I whispered his name, almost like a vow. "I will not let them erase me," I said softly. "Not now, not ever." The next morning, I began to observe the patterns of the nursing home more carefully. Every routine, every schedule, every shift change. I noted when the entrances were least guarded, when the security cameras were angled away, when the staff seemed distracted. Clara, the kind nurse who had treated me with dignity, noticed my sharper attention. "You're thinking," she said, one afternoon, leaning lightly against the doorframe. "And that's a good thing." "I have to," I replied. "They think I'm weak. They think I'm powerless. But I'm not." She gave me a long look, her eyes filled with understanding. She didn't ask questions. She didn't warn me. She simply nodded, and I knew she would help if I needed it. I started piecing together more of the reality I had been thrust into. The paperwork that had disappeared, the bank letters never delivered, the subtle changes to my daily schedule, it all pointed to the same conclusion. My family had been removing me from my life deliberately, step by step, like a painter erasing a canvas. And I had been standing there, silent, watching. Anger shifted into resolve. I began imagining ways to regain control, to reclaim the life that had been stolen. Every detail became critical. The doors, the cameras, the staff schedules. I made mental notes. I observed how the residents moved, which ones could be trusted to stay quiet, which ones complained too loudly. Every small piece of knowledge became a tool in my growing plan. Then came the discovery that shook me even further. While sitting in the common room one afternoon, I noticed a folder tucked beneath a stack of magazines on the reception desk. Curiosity pulled me closer. I waited until the receptionist turned away, then leaned over to glance inside. There it was, documents outlining the sale of the house, the transfer of funds, and most importantly, a copy of the will. A will that had been quietly altered in my absence. The details were precise, almost surgical. My children had assumed control of everything. The house, the savings, even the small investments my husband and I had made together over the years. I wasn't just being excluded from my own life. I was being erased from it entirely. They had calculated it perfectly, thinking no one would notice. And yet, here I was, noticing everything. The room felt suddenly too small. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and exhilaration. I realized that I had a choice. I could continue to live as I had been living, quiet, invisible, dependent, or I could act. I could reclaim what was mine. And I wouldn't just reclaim it silently. I would do so on my own terms. That evening, I returned to my room, clutching the folder to my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed and spread out the documents, reading them carefully, memorizing every detail. Each line, each signature, each date told a story of betrayal, but also of opportunity. They had left a trail, thinking it was for their convenience, but it had given me everything I needed to plan. I thought about my husband, about the life we had built together. I thought about the mornings we had shared, the laughter, the quiet conversations over coffee. I thought about the love we had nurtured and the home we had filled with warmth. And I realized something powerful. They could take the house. They could manipulate the accounts. They could try to erase me. But they could not take my memories, my will, my life itself. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. The kind that comes from knowing your mind is sharp, your body capable, and your heart willing to fight. The betrayal had sparked a fire within me, a fire that refused to be extinguished by silence, manipulation, or absence. That night, I wrote a list, not of tasks, not of chores, but of possibilities. I planned my steps carefully. I marked the times when the staff would be least attentive. I noted which doors could be opened without detection. I memorized the route I would take, the places where I could find help. The allies among the residents who would remain silent if I needed them to. And as I laid the papers down on the small table beside my bed, I whispered once more to the photo of my husband. They thought they could erase me, I said, but they've only reminded me who I am. Sleep came slowly, but it came with a sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, I did not dread tomorrow. I did not fear the days ahead. I had discovered something more valuable than any house or bank account: clarity, awareness, determination, and with that discovery, a plan began to form, a plan that would allow me to reclaim my life on my own terms and remind everyone who had underestimated me that I was far from powerless. The day I decided to leave, the nursing home felt smaller than ever. Every hallway, every door, every fluorescent-lit room seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. But I was no longer the quiet, grieving widow who had arrived weeks ago. I was alert, aware, and ready. I had studied the routines, memorized the schedules, and I knew exactly when the time was right. Morning arrived like any other, the sun filtering weakly through the blinds. Breakfast trays clattered in the hallway. The residents shuffled past me, some too slow to notice, some too lost in their own worlds. I smiled politely at the nurse on duty, who returned the gesture without suspicion. Clara, the only person who had treated me like a person, had already left for her shift, leaving me to rely entirely on my own wits. I waited until the hall was nearly empty. A cart of linen clattered past me, and I seized the moment. My suitcase, which had been quietly packed with essentials weeks before, was at my side. I moved as if I belonged, walking with deliberate calm toward the door that led to the outside world. Each step felt like a pulse, each breath measured and controlled. My heart hammered, not with fear, but with anticipation. I reached the exit and glanced around. The main door was momentarily unmanned. A security camera blinked above me, and I held my breath, remembering the angle I had studied so carefully. One step, another. My hand on the handle. I opened it slowly, silently, and slipped through. Outside, the cool morning air hit my face, sharp and real. The sky stretched wide above me, free and endless. I walked quickly, deliberately, leaving the familiar gray walls behind. The parking lot was empty. The buses that transported residents to appointments had left hours ago. I followed the route I had memorized, past the nurses' station, down the side alley, through the service entrance I had discovered in my observations. Every step was precise, measured, as if rehearsed 1,000 times. By the time I reached the street, I was certain of one thing. I was invisible. They had spent so much energy keeping me confined, so much care in controlling my life, that they assumed I could not act. But I had acted. I had moved, and no one stopped me. I walked briskly, suitcase in hand, my mind racing through possibilities. I knew I could not go back. I could not return to the house that had been sold, to the family that had betrayed me, to the life that had been quietly stolen from me. I needed a new plan, a new beginning, a place where I could live for myself. Hours passed as I navigated the streets. I avoided main roads, blending with pedestrians and early commuters. My suitcase drew a few curious glances. But no one stopped me. I felt a strange exhilaration, a mix of fear and freedom. I was leaving everything behind, yet gaining something far more valuable: control over my own destiny. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a small cafe on the outskirts of town. I found a quiet corner, sat down, and allowed myself a moment to breathe. I ordered a cup of tea and watched the world move around me. People laughed, talked, and went about their lives, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in my own. And yet, I felt a strange kinship with them. The freedom to make choices, to move, to live. It was there, in that quiet cafe, that I made my first real decision as a free woman. I would not run endlessly, nor hide forever. I would establish a life on my own terms. I would find a small home, somewhere peaceful, and create a life that honored my memories, but was no longer chained by betrayal. I would reconnect with myself, the person I had been before grief had silenced me. The night approached, and I moved again, this time seeking shelter in a small guest house I had spotted earlier. I rented a modest room, leaving the suitcase at my side. As I settled in, I allowed myself to finally exhale. I was safe, for now. But more importantly, I was alive, aware, and in control. Back at the nursing home, chaos had begun. When the morning staff realized I was gone, the alarms were raised. My absence was immediately noticed. Phone calls were made. Security was questioned. My family received frantic calls, disbelief heavy in their voices. "She's missing," the nurse told them, her tone clipped. "We don't know where she went." Panic replaced their casual control. The calm, quiet authority they had exercised over me evaporated instantly. They called my children, their voices sharp, panicked, accusatory. "Where is she? Did you know she was planning this?" But no one had anticipated my determination. No one had predicted that the quiet widow, grieving and ignored, would become unstoppable. I knew they were looking, and I smiled quietly to myself. They had tried to erase me, to confine me, to control every aspect of my life. But in their oversight, they had revealed my own power. I had learned their routines, their weaknesses, their assumptions, and I had acted. The night deepened, and I sat by the window of my small room, watching the city lights flicker. My heart was still racing, but in a way that felt exhilarating rather than fearful. I was finally free, not just from the nursing home, not just from my family's control, but from the weight of grief that had held me down for so long. I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. I thought about my husband, about the decades we had shared, and I realized that leaving was not a betrayal of his memory. It was an honoring of it. He had always loved me fiercely, had always protected me. Now, in his absence, I was protecting myself. As I drifted to sleep that night, suitcase beside me, I made a vow. I would not allow anyone to diminish my life again. I would not be erased, silenced, or controlled. I had discovered a strength within me that no grief, no betrayal, and no family could take away. The next morning, I stepped out into the world once more. The streets were quiet, the sun warm on my face. For the first time in weeks, I smiled freely without restraint or fear. I was alone, but not lonely. I was free, and that freedom was more valuable than any home, any inheritance, any comfort my family had tried to impose upon me. Somewhere beyond the city, somewhere peaceful and quiet, a new chapter awaited. I did not know what it would hold, but I knew this. I had reclaimed my life. I had disappeared from those who sought to control me, and in doing so, I had found myself. And for the first time since my husband's death, I felt something I had thought lost forever: hope. By the time my family realized I was gone, panic had already taken hold. The nursing home had alerted them immediately. Phones rang off the hook. Text messages flew between siblings. My daughter's voice, usually calm and composed, now trembled with disbelief. My son's confident tone had collapsed into hurried, anxious questions. They couldn't understand it. They had never imagined I could take control, that I could act. At first, they assumed it was a misunderstanding. "She must be in a doctor's appointment," my daughter suggested, though even she sounded uncertain. My son searched the nearby streets, calling my name into the cold morning air. Every unanswered call made their panic worse. They didn't know where I had gone. They didn't know that the quiet widow they thought had been broken was, in fact, planning her next move all along. They didn't know I had watched, memorized, and waited. When the police were called, the situation escalated. The nursing home staff explained the timeline of my disappearance. "She left this morning," one nurse said. "We thought she was taking a walk, but the exit cameras show she left the building and never returned." The shock on my children's faces must have been palpable, though I wasn't there to see it. I imagined it vividly. The sudden realization that their careful plan to manage me had failed. They had controlled my life for weeks, quietly and efficiently, and yet it had all been for nothing. They immediately began blaming each other. "Why didn't you watch her this morning?" my daughter demanded, her voice tight with anger and fear. My son snapped back, "Don't blame me. You're the one who said she couldn't handle anything on her own." They searched frantically, calling friends, neighbors, and even relatives, hoping someone had seen me. But I had vanished like a ghost, leaving no trace, no warning. And then came the realization that struck them harder than anything else: the financial consequences of my disappearance. The house they had sold, the funds they had transferred, the investments they had quietly assumed control over, all of it was now uncertain. I had left instructions with Clara, the nurse who had quietly supported me, ensuring that no one could access what was mine without my knowledge. The small safety I had secured for myself became a mystery to my children overnight. "They've taken her," my daughter muttered to my son, panic and guilt clashing in her voice. "The funds, the money, what if she disappears with it?" My son ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "We trusted her to stay there. We didn't think she'd do this. Mom would never." He stopped, realizing the truth that cut through him. I had done exactly what they feared and underestimated. Days passed, and the frantic search turned into arguments, accusations, and regret. Friends and neighbors began to murmur. "Where is she?" people asked. "She seemed so calm at the nursing home." Each inquiry reminded my children of their oversight, their arrogance in thinking they could control me. They called the nursing home repeatedly, each time growing more desperate. Staff explained politely, each repetition highlighting their helplessness. Their frustration mounted, not only at the facility, but at themselves. They had underestimated me. And then The reality hit them. The life they had assumed they were building for themselves, the control they had so confidently exercised, was slipping through their fingers. Their mother, the woman they had thought broken and vulnerable, was gone. Not lost, not trapped, not confined, but free. The realization brought panic, anger, and finally, guilt. Guilt is a powerful emotion, particularly when combined with fear and helplessness. My children began to understand, too late, the depth of their betrayal. They had confined me, spoken for me, and assumed my dependence, all while ignoring my pain. They had thought they were protecting me. In truth, they had been imprisoning me. News of my disappearance spread quickly. Friends called, asking if anyone knew where I had gone. Social media posts began circulating. "Missing elderly woman," they read, showing my name and a blurred photo. The fear of public embarrassment added another layer of pressure on my family. I imagined them sitting at home, frantically refreshing their phones, trying to find updates, hoping someone had spotted me. I imagined the frantic calls between them, the arguments that lasted into the night, the gnawing feeling of being powerless. And I smiled quietly, knowing they finally understood, in a small way, the fear I had felt in their hands. The turning point came when a letter arrived. I didn't need to send it directly. Clara delivered it discreetly to my daughter's workplace. The handwriting was unmistakable, my own. The contents were simple, but devastating in their clarity. I am alive. I am safe. I am no longer under your control. The house is gone. The money is secured. And the life you tried to erase me from belongs to me now. I trusted you, and you betrayed me. I am free. I am whole. You will have to live with the choices you made. Love, Mom. The letter shook them to the core. My daughter wept openly. My son sank into a chair, staring blankly at the envelope, understanding in that moment the full scope of their actions and the consequences. They had tried to manage, to control, to dominate, but they had been outwitted by the very person they assumed powerless. The next days were silent on their end, filled with reflection, remorse, and confusion. I had not returned to confront them. I had not sought revenge. I had disappeared, not to punish them, but to reclaim my life. And in that quiet absence, they felt the weight of every choice they had made, the gravity of the betrayal they had committed, and the fear of what they had underestimated. For me, the freedom I had gained was intoxicating. For them, the realization of what they had lost, what they had almost permanently destroyed, was devastating. They had assumed they could erase me from my own life, but the one thing they had forgotten was that I was alive, aware, and capable of reclaiming everything that was mine. And as I looked back, I knew something else. They would never forget me. They would never underestimate me again. The family's reaction was complete, a mix of panic, regret, and helplessness. And though I would not witness their remorse firsthand, I knew it was real, raw, and lasting. The quiet, grieving woman they thought they controlled had disappeared. And in that disappearance, I had delivered the message. I was no longer theirs to manage, to control, or to silence. They had underestimated the power of someone who refuses to be confined. After I had disappeared, I settled into a quiet rhythm of my own choosing. The sun rose and fell over streets I could explore without fear or restriction. I breathed freely, moved freely, and for the first time in weeks, truly felt alive. Yet, there remained one task I had to complete. Not for myself, but for the family who had betrayed me. They needed to understand, finally, the depth of what they had done. I decided to send a message, not an angry one, not filled with accusations or threats. That would be too small, too reactive. Instead, I crafted something deliberate, something that would convey clarity, strength, and finality. I started with a letter. I wrote carefully, every word chosen with precision, every sentence measured. I didn't want to plead. I didn't want to beg. I wanted them to feel the weight of the truth and to recognize the consequences of their choices. To my family, I began. I am alive. I am well. I am safe. I am no longer under your control. You took what you thought you could manage. My house, my finances, my life. But you underestimated one thing. Me. I paused as I wrote, remembering the days in the nursing home. The silence, the loneliness, the moments when I had felt powerless. All of it had fueled this message. All of it had given me clarity and purpose. You tried to erase me, to confine me, to silence me. You made decisions on my behalf without my consent. Assuming that grief had made me weak. You were wrong. I have reclaimed my life. I have reclaimed my independence. You will not control me again. The words flowed from me like a river long held back. I told them about my husband, about the memories they had ignored, about the love that had shaped me and strengthened me. I reminded them that I had always been more than they realized, that beneath my quiet demeanor, there was strength, wisdom, and resolve. The house is gone. The money is secured in a way only I can access. The life you tried to steal from me has been saved by my own hands. I am living it now, fully, peacefully, and on my own terms. You will never find me to demand control again, and that is as it should be. I ended the letter with a closing that surprised even me. I do not write to punish. I write to teach. You have learned too late the danger of underestimating someone you thought weak. I hope that one day you will understand the pain you caused. I am free. I am whole. And I am finally at peace. Love, Mom. I folded the letter neatly and entrusted it to Clara. She had been my quiet ally, the one person who had treated me as human when everyone else tried to manage me like a possession. She agreed to deliver it personally, knowing the impact it would have. The delivery method was important. It would land at a moment when my family could do nothing, when they could only read and absorb the truth. A few days later, I received confirmation. The letters had been delivered. My family had opened them. I imagined their reactions. My daughter's tears, raw and uncontrolled. My son's disbelief, followed by shame. I imagined them reading each word slowly, digesting the reality that they had been outwitted by someone they considered powerless. But the letter alone was not enough. I wanted them to see me, not in person, not physically, but as the vibrant, strong, independent woman I had become. I recorded a short video, standing in the small garden I had found for myself, the sun casting a warm glow across my face. In the video, I spoke directly to them. I am here. I am living. I am safe. And I am finally free. You will not control me again. I hope you understand, now, the consequences of your actions. I do not regret my choice to leave, because it gave me the life you refused to allow me. You wanted to erase me, but I refused, and I am stronger because of it. I kept my tone calm, deliberate, and steady. There was no anger, only quiet authority. I wanted them to feel the weight of my presence, even without my being physically near. I wanted them to know that I was alive, thriving, and no longer theirs to manipulate. Once the video was complete, Clara uploaded it discreetly, sending a link directly to their devices. I did not watch their reactions in real time. I did not need to. I had already taken my power back. Their panic, their guilt, their helplessness. It was enough to know they were finally facing the consequences of their betrayal. Later, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. I sat in my small home, surrounded by books, photos of my husband, and the quiet peace I had owned. For weeks, I had been planning, observing, and preparing. And now, with the letters delivered and the video sent, I could breathe fully for the first time since my husband's death. The emotional weight of the nursing home, the betrayal, and the confinement began to lift. I felt a profound sense of closure, not because my family would understand, but because I had acted. I had reclaimed my life with dignity and strength on my own terms. I realized then that the message I had sent to my family was more than a statement of independence. It was a lesson in respect, in the dangers of underestimating someone's resilience. They had learned, painfully and belatedly, that grief does not equal weakness. Silence does not equal submission. And control over another human being is never guaranteed, especially over a heart that refuses to be confined. In the days that followed, I received no response from my children. They did not come searching for me. They did not demand an explanation. Their silence was the final confirmation. I was truly free. And so, I allowed myself to live, not in revenge, not in anger, but in peace. I tended my garden, walked along quiet streets, visited the small cafes that had become my refuge, and remembered my husband with fondness and gratitude. I wrote in my journal, chronicling this chapter of my life, so that one day I could share the story of a woman who refused to be erased. The letters and the video were more than messages. They were symbols. Symbols of survival, empowerment, and self-respect. They marked the final chapter in the story my family had tried to rewrite without my consent. And in sending them, I had reclaimed what mattered most: my autonomy, my dignity, and my life. For the first time in months, I could look at the horizon and smile. Not a forced, polite smile, but a full, real smile. I had disappeared to find myself. I had sent messages that could never be ignored. And I had finally, irrevocably, taken back my life. In that quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by the freedom I had earned, I whispered to my husband's photo, "We did it. I am free. And I will never let anyone take that from me again." After the letters and the video had been delivered, I no longer felt the weight of expectation pressing down on me. The world I had left behind, the nursing home, the family that had betrayed me, the life they had tried to control, was no longer mine to inhabit. I was free, truly free. And for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without fear, without anger, and without the suffocating pressure of grief compounded by betrayal. I left the city quietly. I had long ago picked a place in my mind, a small countryside village, far enough that no one could easily find me. yet close enough that I could manage the life I wanted. The road there was winding, lined with tall trees and fields stretching farther than the eye could see. I drove slowly, taking in the scenery, letting the wind carry away the last remnants of confinement and sorrow. The hum of the car engine became a meditation, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, steady, strong, alive. When I arrived, the village seemed untouched by time. Cobblestone streets wound past small cottages with flower boxes in the windows, their colors vibrant against the soft greens of the surrounding hills. A gentle stream ran nearby, and the air carried the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers, the kind of place I had only imagined in my dreams, a place where life was quiet, deliberate, and unhurried. I rented a small cottage on the edge of the village. It was modest, but warm, with a little garden that begged for attention. The walls were painted a soft cream, and the windows opened onto a view of rolling hills. Perfect. Not because it was extravagant, but because it was mine. I arranged my belongings carefully, placing my husband's photo in a central spot, alongside mementos that reminded me of our life together. The suitcase that had accompanied me on my escape became a permanent part of my home, a symbol of the journey I had taken and the strength I had discovered within myself. The days settled into a peaceful rhythm. I rose with the sun, tending to the garden that reminded me of life's resilience. I planted flowers and herbs, watching them grow and bloom under my care. I prepared meals slowly, savoring the process and the flavors, a stark contrast to the mechanical trays I had endured in the nursing home. I walked through the village, greeting neighbors with a smile, exchanging brief conversations that felt genuine and grounding. The world felt real again, and I was a part of it on my own terms. Most evenings, I would sit by the window, tea in hand, watching the sky change colors as the sun set over the hills. The stillness of the countryside brought clarity and peace, allowing me to reflect on the months of pain, betrayal, and isolation I had endured. I realized that each step I had taken, from the grief that had seemed unbearable to the bold decision to disappear, had led me here, to a life of autonomy, dignity, and quiet joy. I thought often about my family, though I did not dwell on anger. Their panic, guilt, and confusion had been enough to satisfy the need for accountability. I had sent them letters and a video, ensuring they understood the depth of their actions and the consequences of underestimating me. That was all I required. My life was no longer theirs to manipulate or control, and I would not allow them to diminish my peace any longer. One morning, I discovered a small bookshop tucked behind a hedge along the village road. It smelled of old paper and polished wood, the kind of smell that carried memories and stories in its scent. I stepped inside and felt immediately at home. The shopkeeper, a kind woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, welcomed me warmly. I spent hours browsing the shelves, finding solace in the stories of others, in lives lived boldly, in journeys of resilience and courage. It became part of my routine. I would visit the shop frequently, finding books that inspired, challenged, and comforted me. Occasionally, I would read in the garden, the pages of a book rustling softly in the breeze, the only sounds, the chirping of birds, and the gentle hum of life around me. These small, deliberate acts of self-care were profound. They reminded me that freedom was not just the absence of confinement, but the presence of choice, the ability to live deliberately and authentically. Over time, the villagers came to know me, not as the woman who had once been trapped by grief or betrayal, but as a quiet, resilient presence in their community. I was greeted with smiles, invited to local gatherings, and welcomed into conversations. Each interaction reinforced the sense that I belonged, not because someone controlled my presence, but because I chose to be there, fully, intentionally, and on my own terms. I often revisited the memories of my husband, honoring him in my own way. I tended the garden, imagining him walking beside me. I prepared meals I knew he would have enjoyed, setting a place at the table for him in my thoughts. I spoke aloud to him sometimes, laughing softly at our shared jokes, whispering the words we had exchanged over decades. Though he was gone, his presence remained in the lessons he had taught me, in the life we had built together, and in the courage he had instilled within me. As weeks turned into months, I realized that I was no longer haunted by the past. The pain of betrayal, the grief of loss, and the silence of abandonment had been transformed into strength, clarity, and self-respect. I had reclaimed my life, not with anger or vengeance, but with courage and wisdom. I had discovered that the greatest freedom comes not from escaping others, but from embracing oneself. On quiet evenings, as the sky painted itself in shades of pink and gold, I would sit in my garden and watch the sun dip below the horizon. The air was filled with the soft sounds of life, the rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children, the hum of insects returning to their homes. In those moments, I felt a profound sense of completeness. I was alive. I was free. I was whole. And finally, I whispered, as I had done countless times in my journey, "We did it. I am free. I am alive. And I will never let anyone take this from me again." The house, the betrayal, the confinement, they were all behind me now. What lay ahead was entirely my own. A life of peace, choice, and dignity. I had discovered strength I had never imagined, resilience I had never recognized, and freedom I had been denied for too long. In that quiet countryside, surrounded by the simple beauty of the world and the memories of love that had shaped me, I had finally arrived. Not in a place defined by others, but in a life I had claimed entirely for myself. The journey had been painful, but it had brought me to the most precious discovery of all, the unshakable power and courage of a woman who refused to be erased. And as night fell over the hills, the stars appearing one by one in the velvet sky, I felt complete. I was finally home, not in a house, not in the hands of others, but in myself. Months had passed since I arrived in the countryside. The quiet village had become my sanctuary, a place where I was no longer defined by loss, betrayal, or confinement, but by my own choices, resilience, and life experience. Each day carried a gentle rhythm, unlike the rigid schedules of the nursing home or the controlling oversight of my family. Here, I was free, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. I often thought about the journey that had brought me here. The grief that had initially crushed me after my husband's death had transformed into something I could harness, a kind of quiet power. I had been forced to confront betrayal, loneliness, and the shocking reality that the people I loved most could fail me in ways I never imagined. But those experiences had also been the catalyst for my awakening. I had discovered strength I hadn't known existed, courage I hadn't realized I possessed, and the unshakable will to take control of my own life. Every morning, I tended my little garden. The soil between my fingers grounded me. The plants I nurtured reminded me that life continues even after pain. Flowers bloomed in brilliant colors. Herbs released their fragrant scents into the air. It was a living metaphor for my own journey. From grief and betrayal, growth and beauty could emerge. I smiled each morning at the sunrise, feeling gratitude for another day, another chance to live fully. I also found ways to honor my husband's memory. I kept his photograph in a place of prominence in my cottage, alongside mementos of our travels, love letters, and little trinkets that told the story of our shared life. In these items, I found comfort and inspiration. I often spoke to him aloud, not in sorrow, but in reflection. We made it through everything. I'm still standing. I'm living the life we dreamed of, even if it's only me now. Sometimes I thought about my family too. Their panic, their guilt, and their eventual understanding had all been lessons for them, though delivered too late for apologies or reconciliation to matter in any real sense. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't desire confrontation. The letters I sent and the video I recorded had delivered the message they needed to hear. I was no longer theirs to control. That knowledge alone, the certainty of my independence, was enough. In the village, I began to form quiet connections with people who reminded me of what community could truly be. A few neighbors invited me for tea. A local shopkeeper saved books she thought I would enjoy. The village children often waved at me as I walked past, and I waved back, feeling a small but significant connection to life outside my walls. These relationships were not burdensome. They were mutual, built on respect and kindness, not obligation or control. One crisp morning, I took a walk along the stream that ran near the village edge. The water shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting trees and sky, as if holding a mirror to my own life. I paused to watch a mother duck with her ducklings paddling along. A small reminder that life moves forward, no matter how fragile it may seem. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. My life was no longer about what had been taken from me. It was about what I could create, nurture, and experience from this moment forward. I began journaling each day, recording thoughts, experiences, and small joys. Sometimes I wrote about my husband. Sometimes I wrote about the village, the people, and the freedom I had fought for. My journal became a testament to resilience, a chronicle of survival, and a blueprint for hope. I imagined one day sharing it, not for pity or drama, but to show that even in the darkest times, a person could reclaim their power and create a meaningful, independent life. The letters and video I had sent to my family remained in my thoughts, but they no longer consumed me. I knew they had felt the weight of my actions, and that understanding had already brought them lessons I could not enforce with my own hands. Their guilt, confusion, and panic were natural consequences of their choices. I forgave them silently, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I needed peace. Forgiveness freed me from carrying anger, bitterness, or resentment, and allowed me to embrace the life I had fought so hard to secure. As spring arrived, the village blossomed in ways that mirrored my own life. Trees grew greener, flowers flourished, and the air seemed lighter. I planted new seeds in my garden, symbolizing the new chapter I was creating for myself. I tended each plant with care, remembering that growth requires patience, resilience, and hope, qualities I had rediscovered in myself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky with streaks of pink and gold. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. I looked at my hands, worn but steady, and smiled at the journey they had carried me through. I thought about every moment of grief, every pang of betrayal, and every step I had taken to reclaim my life. Each hardship had been a lesson. Each challenge had revealed the depth of my courage. In that quiet moment, I realized I was finally at peace. The past was no longer a chain around my wrists. It was a story I carried, not a weight I bore. I was free in every sense, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And the life before me was mine alone to live, create, and enjoy. As night fell, I stepped into the garden one last time before heading indoors. The stars glittered overhead, vast and eternal, reminding me that the universe is wide enough for everyone to carve their own place. I whispered to the night, to the memory of my husband, and to the life I had finally claimed. We made it. I am alive, I am free, and I am whole. Nothing can take this from me again. And with that, I returned inside, closing the door behind me, not in fear, but in confidence. I had left the past behind. I had reclaimed my life. I had found peace, independence, and joy. And as I looked out the window at the quiet village below, I knew that every sunrise from this day forward would belong entirely to me, bright, hopeful, and full of possibility. The story that had begun with grief, betrayal, and loss had ended with freedom, self-discovery, and empowerment. I had disappeared from control, emerged into clarity, and now lived fully, deliberately, and unashamedly. In the end, I had discovered the most important truth of all. Life is not about what others take from you, but about what you are willing to claim for yourself. And I had claimed everything. Seasons passed, and the village had become more than a refuge. It was home. I awoke each morning to sunlight spilling across my little cottage, the gentle songs of birds greeting me, and the cool breeze carrying the scent of earth and flowers. Life no longer felt like something imposed upon me. It was something I shaped with my own hands, with my own choices, and with my own heart. I had learned to find joy in small, deliberate actions. Each morning, I tended the garden, pulling weeds, planting seeds, and watering the soil with care. Each plant that grew and flourished reminded me that resilience is nurtured, that growth often follows hardship, and that beauty can emerge from even the hardest of soils. The garden became a symbol of my life, a testament to my persistence, my strength, and my determination to thrive. I also began to explore the surrounding countryside. Each walk along winding paths, past rivers and hills, reminded me how vast the world is, how many places exist beyond confinement and sorrow. I watched children play in the meadows, couples strolling hand in hand, and elderly villagers tending their own gardens. In all of it, I saw a life that was free, ordinary, and yet extraordinary in its simple authenticity, and I felt fully, completely part of it. The memories of the nursing home and my family's betrayal remained, but they no longer held power over me. They were like distant echoes, reminders of what I had survived, of the courage I had discovered, and of the autonomy I had claimed. I did not dwell on anger or revenge, because those emotions would only have tethered me to a past that no longer belonged to me. Instead, I felt gratitude, grateful for my survival, my clarity, and the opportunity to start anew. I wrote often in my journal, chronicling each day, each thought, and each discovery. I documented my feelings, my reflections on freedom, and the small triumphs that marked my independence. Sometimes I read back over my entries, marveling at the journey I had taken. From grief and confinement to empowerment and peace, the pages became a mirror of my transformation, a record of resilience, and a celebration of life reclaimed. Neighbors began to recognize me not as the widow who had disappeared, not as the elderly woman with a tragic past, but as a person with wisdom, kindness, and a quiet strength. I joined the small community in simple ways, sharing baked bread with a neighbor, offering advice to young gardeners, and occasionally helping the local bookstore with organizing events. Each connection was voluntary, genuine, and free from expectation. I had learned the value of relationships built on choice, respect, and shared humanity. Some days, I would sit quietly by the window, looking out at the hills as the sun began to set. The colors of dusk reflected the journey I had undergone, hues of grief, streaks of anger, the deep purples of reflection, and finally the gold of hope. I realized that the story I had lived, full of pain, betrayal, and escape, had shaped me into someone stronger, wiser, and more alive than I had ever been before. Occasionally, I would think about my family. I did not seek to punish them, nor did I expect them to understand fully. My letters and video had delivered the message they needed to hear, and that was sufficient. They had learned, albeit too late, the consequences of their choices. I felt compassion for them, even as I acknowledged their failures. Their inability to respect my autonomy had caused pain, but it had also been a catalyst for my transformation. Without their betrayal, I may never have discovered the depth of my own strength. One spring morning, as I walked along a path lined with blooming wildflowers, I felt a sense of closure unlike anything I had experienced before. I had arrived at a place where grief had been transformed into wisdom, betrayal into resilience, and loss into opportunity. I understood now that freedom is not merely escaping captivity or deception. It is the conscious choice to live fully, authentically, and deliberately, no matter the cost. I paused near a stream, listening to the water trickle over stones, clear and persistent. I dipped my fingers into the cool flow and watched it move, unstoppable, carving its path through the earth. And I thought, this is my life now, fluid, deliberate and free. I am the one who shapes it, who nurtures it, and who ensures it flows in the direction I choose. That evening, I returned home and lit a small candle in memory of my husband. I whispered his name softly, smiling at the life we had shared and the lessons he had left me. The candle flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. And I felt the warmth of continuity, a bridge between past love and present independence. It reminded me that while people may leave, memories endure, and the lessons learned from them can guide every choice I make. I realized that my story, which had begun in grief and betrayal, had culminated in empowerment and serenity. I had escaped confinement, reclaimed autonomy, and built a life rooted in choice, dignity, and self-respect. And now, in the quiet of my cottage, surrounded by the beauty of the countryside and the small joys of daily life, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I knew that the journey of life is never free from hardship, loss, or disappointment, But I also knew that strength, courage, and determination can transform those hardships into a life worth living. I had been underestimated, betrayed, and silenced, but in claiming my freedom, I had discovered my truest self. As night fell, the stars began to emerge, each one shining with quiet brilliance. I stood on my porch, gazing at the sky, feeling the enormity of life stretching endlessly before me. I whispered to the universe, to the memory of my husband, and to myself. I am alive, I am free, I am whole, and this is my life, entirely my own. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the fragrance of earth and flowers. It felt like the world was acknowledging my journey, honoring the strength and resilience I had discovered. For the first time in years, I felt truly complete. Not because the past had been erased, but because I had reclaimed my life from it. In the weeks and months that followed, my days remained simple but deeply fulfilling. I cultivated friendships, nurtured my garden, explored the countryside, and continued writing in my journal. Each sunrise reminded me that life is a gift, and each sunset reminded me that I had earned my peace through courage and determination. And so I lived, not as a victim of circumstances, not as a pawn in someone else's life, but as the author of my own story. I had disappeared, yes, but in that disappearance, I had found clarity, independence, and joy. My past no longer defined me. My future was mine to shape. And in the quiet of the countryside, under the golden light of dawn, or the silver glow of stars, I whispered once more, fully and freely, I am alive. I am free. I am home.